Hello all, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/6 scale M3 Lee. The model in this video belongs to my private collection. However, if anyone's interested in a commission build of a vehicle to this exact same specifications, pricing and availability information can be acquired by emailing me through the following email address, info@EastCoastArmory.com. Before I go into any more information about the model, let's do a quick walk around. The model that you see here started off as a rotomold plastic M3 Lee kit from Plastic Panzers. This version here, like I mentioned before, is the M3 Lee. However, Plastic Panzers also offers the M3 Grant as a kit as well. The M3 Grant contains the same lower hull. The only difference is the addition of the British style larger 37mm turret. The model that you see here was built back in 2009, and before building it, I was fortunate enough to visit and thoroughly photograph the real M3 Grant, which was on display at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds at the time. Because of the photography of that vehicle, I was able to put a lot of details into this model, which would have been commonly overlooked if not for visiting the real one. This model also features lots of workable functions as well as other functional details. We'll be going over these details in this video. In addition to the details, a lot of the components that you see on this model are available and are listed on the EastCoastArmory.com product line. Starting with the model suspension, the model features a functional VVSS M3 Lee suspension from EastCoastArmory.com. The suspension itself is very similar in size and dimensions as the ones for the M4 Sherman. However, on the Lee, they're slightly different. Keep in mind the Lee predated the Sherman, and so the Sherman was really built upon lessons learned from building the M3 Lee. Just like my Sherman suspension, the M3 Lee suspension is also fully functional. The vehicle also rolls fairly easily. Moving on to the model's idlers. The rear idler wheels we see here are the early style open spoke idlers. The idlers as well as the idler mounts are also listed on EastCoastArmory.com. As for the track that you see fitted to this vehicle is actually from Plastic Panzers. The links themselves are made out of ABS plastic. They are very durable and are fully functional. Only thing needed to assemble the track are lengths of steel rods that get inserted into the teeth and pin everything together. The model sprocket is also from plastic panzers. The sprocket itself is made out of CNC nylon and is also a very nice piece. It's very durable and has separate stars which get assembled to the sprocket hub via fasteners, very similar to the real one. The lower hull plate features all the details found on the real one, including riveting, axis panels, as well as the rounded rigidity strips for the suspension. While on the subject of the riveting, the biggest defining feature of the M3 Lee series was the fact that the hulls were all riveted together. Keep in mind, at the time, electrical arc welding was just at the time being figured out, and so to get these tanks produced, they went ahead and opted for the use of riveting. As for the riveting themselves, each rivet that you see was applied by hand and is casted in resin. The rivets themselves are also offered on eastcoastarmory.com. As for the number and spacing of rivets, this was all painstakingly counted from the real one that I saw in person. The vehicle features two sizes of riveting. The most common are the larger rivets that we see here. As the video progresses, you will also see areas where smaller rivets were utilized as opposed to the larger dome rivets that are on the side of the hull. Moving our way to the rear portion of the vehicle, we can see here the idler mount, the rear hatch for the engine, as well as the air filters and the exhaust. All these components that I just mentioned are listed on the eastcoastarmory.com product line. One thing as of note about the M3 Lee that we can see is that there is no tow hitch in the center portion of the rear hull. Early versions of the Sherman also had this feature. The addition of a tow hitch mount and the tow hitch came a little bit later, and it's typically found on the M4 Sherman, but not on the M3 Lees. As for the rear detailing that you see here, this Lee represents more of a mid or late production style M3 Lee. What distinguishes that is the layout of the exhaust as well as the air filters. The original versions of the M3 Lee featured goosenecking pepper pot style exhaust that came out of these two locations here and here. The pepper pot exhausts were replaced, and the final layout is that of the dual ductwork style exhaust that we have on the top portion of the hull. This system here is a mirror image on the M4 Sherman equipped with the radial engine. Both the M3 Lee as well as the M4 Sherman utilize the exact same power plant, that being of the radial engine. When the M3 Lee went to this style of rear end, the holes for the original style exhaust were plated over with two round plates that were bolted in place. Also, when the M3 Lee was modified with that of the rear air filters, this plate was needed to be fabricated and added to the rear portion of the wall. The reason for this plate is to mount the air filter to this side of the tank. The original versions of the M3 Lee have this component here absent. Moving from the air filters, we have here the two rear mud flaps. The mud flaps on the M3 were very distinctive in that they had several rigidity ridges welded to them that created a claw-like appearance. The versions that you see on my model are made out of sheet metal and are all soldered together. These fenders here are also listed on eastcoastarmory.com. Moving our way to the taillight. As you can see, the taillight itself is mounted a little bit differently than on the M4 Sherman. It's literally just bolted right to the side of the tank via a bracket, and its power cord enters into the tank from this location here. Also, as we can see, the taillight on this side is blacked out, while on the reverse side of the vehicle is painted red. Here goes the light on the opposite side. This style of format with the left-hand version painted red and the right lens blacked out is pretty much standard on all American AFV. Also, while here, we can also see the angles, the angle iron rivet setup that was utilized in its construction. In addition to the angle iron, we can also see the two different size of rivets. On this panel here are the larger rivets, while on this plate here are the smaller ones that I mentioned earlier. Moving our way to the front of the vehicle, we have here the three-piece transmission cover. The three-piece transmission cover was, just like the name says, was comprised of three separate pieces. The three pieces were bolted together as a flange-style format, and then the whole unit was then bolted to the tank via rivet strip on top, strip of bolts on the bottom, as well as bolts found on the side portion of the vehicle. This system that we see here later on evolved and was used on the M4 Sherman. The only difference between the two units was that on the M3 Lee, this portion here of the flange was different. As we could see, it is squared off compared to the other set of bolts. The reason for this piece being squared off was because of the side sponson-mounted 75mm gun. Because of this extra plate that runs horizontal on the tank, a small notch was casted into the casting in order to bolt it in these four locations here. The rest of the bolt flange is the same on the M4 Sherman. As for the model itself, some modifications were made, namely the bolts that you see here are all real fasteners. The piece all has its cast texture added, as well as its foundry marks. In addition to the foundry marks, the Zerk fittings and oil drainage plugs were all added and painted in red, as are the rest of the Zerk fittings on the tank suspension. The flange segments were also thoroughly enhanced, making the look that the piece is three separate components a lot more believable. Another piece that was added were the tow eyes on the bottom portion here. These two components here are also listed on East Coast Armory Dock. Moving our way up from the lower hull brings us to the engine deck. On the two sides of the engine deck we have storage boxes for various crew equipment. These came a little bit later on in the M3 Lee's life cycle and were not present on the earlier versions. Boxes that you see on this model are made out of sheet metal and are all soldered together. They are fully functional, including both with a full working latch and opening lid. If we notice on the top portion of both boxes, we have tools. On this side here, we have the axe, pickaxe handle, and on this side here, we have the shovel. As a note with the shovel, the handle on the shovel is the early war version that utilized a wooden handle as opposed to the crimped steel handle that is found on later versions of American tanks. All of the mounting equipment that you see on the boxes are all soldered on, making for a very realistic and strong setup. On the center of the rear deck here, we have some more tools. We have the crowbar and we have the large wrench. The large wrench is held down with that of a retention pin, as well as with leather straps, which are not found on this model. On the center portion of the engine deck here would be the tank's tow cable, which would be strapped in this location here where we have the weathering. In the center portion of the engine deck we have here is the grillwork and air intake for the tank's radial engine. The grillwork frame itself is all made out of soldered steel, and the meshwork is aluminum varmint mesh. Also, if we can notice, rivets are used for most of the assembly. However, on the engine deck itself, it's all hex bolts. Purpose of this is obviously with the removal of the hex bolts, the whole engine hatch rear deck can be removed. Moving our way to the fluid filler caps. Like with all of my builds, the filler caps themselves are fully functional. Removal of a chain retained pin. And the piece opens up. The filler cap itself, like on the rest of my builds, is made out of turned aluminum and is very realistic to the real one. This is true for each one of the filler caps on this model. Moving our way forward leads us to the one corner plate. As we can see, one thing of detail that I added was on this portion here, there is a small slot screw. As for the purpose of this slot screw, I'm not sure. However, this slot screw is present on the Aberdeen Grand. Now, one thing that distinguishes this tank as an M3 Lee as opposed to an M3 Grant is that of the antenna well, or the antenna base mount. On the American M3 Lee, the tank's radio would be mounted in this location here. Because of that, the antenna for the radio emerges from this portion of the hull. To mount the antenna to the hull, a cast metal teacup style mount was developed. The teacup bolts to the plate and holds the antenna base in its location. As we can see, here goes the wire for the antenna, emerging from the bottom of the antenna base into the vehicle. As we can see, the teacup itself is actually a hollow casting and is only there as a framework to hold up the antenna base. For the antenna base itself, we notice on this model I didn't use my standard MP48. For this model, I utilized the MP37 spring antenna base. The MP37 better suits the M3 Lee as it's an earlier style antenna base that predates the MP48. The MP37 is another addition found on the EastCoastArmory.com product line, and just like the MP48, features a real spring. Also, one difference that we could see from the 37 from the 48 is the insulator is mounted on a different location. On the MP48, the insulator is found on the top right before the antenna emerges from the top portion of the base. While on the 37, it's reversed. The insulator is mounted on the bottom of the antenna base. As for the insulator itself, just like the MP48, it's also made out of a ceramic material and is painted to match the ceramic look on this model. What's interesting about the antenna and the antenna base right here is that because of this component is why the British requested to have a different turret for their tanks. When the Ministry of Defense was examining the M3 Lee for adoption, they were satisfied with the tank. However, the one request they had was to move the radio from the hull into the turret. Because the radio was moved into the turret, a larger turret was developed with a larger rear bustle in order to mount in the radio equipment. Once the radio equipment was moved into the turret, this location here was no longer needed for the antenna, and so this equipment here is missing on the British M3 Grant. Moving from the antenna base leads us to the fire extinguisher cluster. Just like on the M4 Sherman, which utilizes two handles in order to trigger the fire suppression equipment found on the tank's interior. On the M3 Lee, though, they are in two separate housings as opposed to the one unit housing that's found on the Shermans. Also, like on the Shermans, the clusters are found in the exact same location. And also like on the Shermans, as well as any other American AFV, the handles themselves should be painted in red for high visibility. Moving on to the opposite side of the vehicle, we have a vision port, and we have the reverse angle plate. As we can see, this plate's a little bit different than the other one in that rather than the fasteners being rivets, on this plate here, there's slot screws. And on the angle brace plate, the part that mounts the angle to the plate is riveted on, while the other portion is actually hex bolts. The purpose of removable fasteners, this location here, was for fitting and removal of the 75mm gun. In order to fit the 75mm gun into its location, this entire plate would be removed, and that would allow sufficient accessibility in order to install the gun. Once the gun's installed, the plate simply gets rebolted into the position that you see here.